Has the EU failed the Western Balkans? After promising a bright EU future to the region at the Thessaloniki summit back in 2003, in the years since, the EU has apparently failed to deliver on its promises. Years of enlargement fatigue has meant many Balkan countries have found themselves sitting in the waiting room, with no prospect of membership in the near future. After years of conflict and instability, the prospect of EU membership was in some sense the glue holding the Balkans together. But as its citizens have become increasingly disillusioned with the EU, space for separatist politics has opened up, and interethnic tensions have escalated. So in this video, we're going to have a look at the EU's policy towards the Balkans, how the EU has apparently fallen short, and how this has affected the region's politics. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Firstly, let's start with a bit of context. With the exception of Albania, the Western Balkans are all former countries of Yugoslavia, including Serbia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. As viewers will probably know, in the 90s, these countries were embroiled in years of war and violence with disastrous consequences. When the dust settled in the early 2000s, membership to the EU was seen as a way to bring economic prosperity and political stability to the region. These years were marked by an optimism that the Balkans had a future in the EU, especially after Romania and Bulgaria actually joined the bloc in 2007, demonstrating the EU's interest in enlarging to include countries in the region, even if they were relatively poor. The Western Balkan countries began to receive money for development from the EU in the 2000s, and their economies began to grow. EU membership required these countries to resolve their conflicts, so membership was seen as a positive way to promote peace in the region. Big moves were made towards peace, with mass war crime convictions, official apologies made by heads of state, and a quelling of nationalist sentiment, as people turned their political focus towards Europe. Unfortunately, this didn't continue into the 2010s, as successive EU crises made accession more difficult, and contributed to a reduction in official development assistance. Out of all the countries present at the Thessaloniki summit in 2003, Croatia became the only EU member in 2013. Since then, enlargement fatigue has dominated EU politics, as internal disputes have made the EU hesitant to accept new members. Some of this seems to be a consequence of the fact that, without the immediate threat of conflict, the EU lost some of the political will, or at least some of the sense of urgency, to integrate the Balkans into the European project, and they've since become a bit of an afterthought in European politics. Today, the Western Balkan countries are the poorest in the region, the most undemocratic, and after 2 decades, are still a way away from EU membership. So, what actually went wrong between the Western Balkans and the EU? Well, as we see it, there were broadly 3 things. Number 1, the EU's inconsistent approach to accession. Number 2, their failure to resolve regional conflicts. And 3, their failure to properly address corruption. Firstly, let's start with the EU's inconsistent approach to accession. Those who have been following EU politics will be very aware that the EU is proactively accelerating Moldova and Ukraine EU applications. But while this is of course understandable, it's also really irritated some Balkan countries, who see it as unfair to other countries who have been adapting to EU accession conditions for years. The EU also seems to be inconsistent in its requirement for solving territorial disputes for candidate status. For example, the EU has said that Moldova does not need to resolve the status of its breakaway region of Transnistria before joining, and Cyprus joined the EU in 2004 despite being divided. This hasn't gone down well with countries like Bosnia, Kosovo and Serbia, who are being delayed accession because of their own territorial disputes or secessionist politics. The point we're making is that many Balkan countries have been upset by what they see as the EU's inconsistent application of its membership criteria, and populist separatist leaders have duly taken advantage of the situation. For instance, the president of Bosnia's autonomous entity, Republika Srpska, has argued that last December's accession talks were a response to Russian Western tensions, not a genuine push for Bosnia's EU integration. These claims may have some truth as well, given that a recent EU-wide opinion poll found that only 28% of EU citizens were in favour of Bosnia joining the bloc. On top of that, other Balkan countries who are actually in the EU have used their membership, which gives them a veto over other countries' accession, as leverage to essentially win regional disputes. These demands range from more trivial whose culture is whose disputes to more substantial demands for macro-institutional rearrangements. Because it has ongoing disagreements with both Greece and Bulgaria, North Macedonia has been on the receiving end of a lot of these vetoes, and has made perhaps the most concessions for EU membership. For context, Greece doesn't like the fact that the country has the same name as the Macedonia region in northern Greece, and Bulgaria blocked their candidacy on the grounds that they thought that the Macedonian language was simply Bulgarian by another name. Then there's more serious, potentially destabilising demands. For instance, Croatia, an EU member, has stated that there will be no progress on the European path for Bosnia until the Croatian national question is resolved. For context, Bosnia has three main ethnic groups: the Croats, Serbs, and Bosniaks, and its constitution is set to make sure that all have equal representation, such as having 3 presidents for each ethnicity. So the Croatian national problem in question seems to be a demand for reform of Bosnia's electoral law to represent more of the Croat population. The Federation of Bosnia has resisted these demands on the grounds that it would stoke ethnic tension and further segregate a country that's already very divided. But when or if Bosnia begins its negotiations, these demands may get stronger. So you get the idea. This apparent inconsistent application of membership criteria, and the veto power wielded against candidate countries by current Balkan EU members, are widely regarded as unfair in the Western Balkans. This takes us to our second reason how the EU has let down the Balkans: their failure to resolve lingering conflicts. In short, the EU has been criticised for failing to resolve regional conflicts, instead preferring short-term fixes that sweep disagreements under the rug. This is most notable in Kosovo, where an EU-mediated deal between Kosovo and Serbia last year fell apart within a month of it being signed. Some have argued that the war in Ukraine frightened the EU over regional instability, leading them to rush into creating a quick deal. Since the collapse of this deal, things have only gotten way worse. Last Monday, the EU Special Representative for Kosovo and Serbia said that the path to normalisation between the two has shown little progress, and a new conflict is currently brewing over the Kosovan government's recent attempts to abolish Serbian currency. Tellingly, only 2 weeks prior to the enforcement of these new rules, the EU still hadn't come to a common position on the changes, which gives you a sense of how much political capital is being invested in the Balkans. In the end, the EU decided to ask Kosovo to opt out for a longer-term transition, in fears of escalating ethnic tension, but this obviously isn't a long-term solution. Croatian-Serbian relations also haven't fared well in the last 10 years, in part because Croatia has leveraged its EU membership against Serbia. The two countries fought each other during Croatia's War of Independence, and have since had very cold relations. In 2022, Croatia threatened Serbia's EU negotiations for wanting to indict 2 Croatian generals of war crimes from the 1995 Croatian War of Independence, with Croatia's parliamentary speaker commenting, if they want to progress towards EU, they must behave like Europeans. Though it isn't widely covered in EU news coverage, the Croatian government has faced criticism by its neighbours and at home for not acknowledging war crimes. Political analyst Žarko Bahovski has argued that since Croatia's entry into the EU in 2013, the downplaying of war crimes has actually become more prevalent, as right-wing nationalist politics returned in Croatia. Essentially, in part because the EU has failed to resolve regional conflicts, nationalist sentiment in the West Balkans has increased, making diplomatic resolution even more difficult. Now, finally, the last thing we want to discuss is corruption. Despite the fact that the EU finances anti-corruption measures using their Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance Fund, corruption is on the rise in the Western Balkans, especially in Bosnia and Serbia. Obviously, the EU has limited power to enforce anti-corruption measures on non-EU states, and can do little where there's widespread state capture. But at the same time, the EU Commission and Member States have avoided critical reflection on current funding models that funnel EU funds to corrupt political elites, hoping it will lead to democratic changes. In fact, even though countries are complying with EU accession conditions and making changes, corruption is on the rise, liberal democracy is declining, and ruling elites have more power than ever. And the EU's conditionality for accession has actually strengthened this state capture in 3 ways. Firstly, by pushing market liberalisation without a good legal framework. A lot of Balkan countries have weak judicial systems, which means that what we might describe as neoliberal economics can lead to a small group of wealthy individuals gaining too much power. Second, top-down conditionality weakens internal accountability and can be used by autocrats to silence critics, because if their criticism gets out, the coin tray won't receive the funds. Thirdly, any progress made towards joining the EU and any interactions with EU officials can inadvertently give more legitimacy to Balkan politicians, even if they're autocratic. Perhaps the best example of this is President Aleksandar Vučić in Serbia, who's so far done just enough to maintain peaceful relations with Kosovo. Maintaining stability in the Balkans is a top priority for the EU, and so, in this sense, Vučić has become somewhat of a reliable partner for the EU, at least more reliable than Serbia's weak opposition bloc and far-right parties. But in backing Vučić, who has been widely accused of autocratic practices, the EU has undermined its credibility in choosing stability over democracy. Because they, in some sense, rely on Vučić for regional stability, the EU has had to overlook an array of evidence linking state officials to organised crimes, and credible accusations of Vučić's party cheating in recent parliamentary elections. So those are the 3 things that have strained the EU's relationship with the Western Balkans. Apparently inconsistent application of membership criteria, a failure to find sustainable solutions to regional conflicts, and a failure to actually address corruption and state capture. Now, we don't want to be too critical of the EU here, and European anxieties about further enlargement are well founded. But perhaps the headline takeaway for the EU should be that if it wants to fulfill its promises, it should prioritise the boring business of internal reform. Geopolitics and national security issues definitely seem to be getting more difficult right now, as we regularly cover in our videos. But when it comes to your personal security, that's never been easier, thanks to our sponsor NordVPN. That's because NordVPN offers you one-click protection, with their threat protection service shielding you from malware, trackers, and ads, especially when you're on dodgy public Wi-Fi networks. Not only that, their dark web monitoring service actively notifies you if someone leaks your credentials, helping you stay one step ahead. All of this protection doesn't have to come at the expense of great connection though, with NordVPN offering the very fastest service of any VPN, allowing you to connect almost instantly anywhere in the world. Throw in their 24/7 customer service, dedicated apps on all major platforms, one account protecting 6 devices, and 30 days money-back guarantee, it's hard to come up with reasons not to sign up. Plus, if you sign up for a 2-year plan using our link, you'll not only get a massive discount, but you also get 4 extra months totally free. So if you're trying to improve our journalism by signing up for Nord, make sure you click our link and you'll get their great service at a discount.